There has been some discussion over the last few days about an alleged Miyamoto quote which appears to have been cannibalized from an interview in October 2024 into a version that rather misrepresented what he originally said. The original quote, in the best translation I can find, is ultimately what people remember are the intellectual properties. Games become obsolete when new versions come out, but that's incredibly sad. We started video production partly because of that sadness, seeing our creations become playable only on Virtual Console. Even making them playable in a museum has its limits, but video content can endure forever. End quote. Now, what a lot of people have found interesting about this is the talk about the move into film development, but actually, I find the first part of the quote more intriguing. In this video, I want to look at games as a format compared to film and video and look at the rise and rise of what I'm going to call forever games. First up, it should be said that while format changes must hit Miyamoto hard, given that it's his babies that are going off the shelf, Nintendo has made a lot of money over the years from boosting old games onto new hardware, but it's also the case that those transitions often come with a degree of compromise. Nintendo Switch Online's capacity to allow people to use original controllers is perhaps the closest to being spiritually the same as the original hardware that they've offered outside one-offs like the NES and SNES mini consoles, but nothing's going to be perfect at replicating that original experience, and unless you want to have a house full of older hardware, it becomes progressively more difficult to play older games. Moreover, while Switch 2 is backward compatible and may have a long generation in front of it, that system too will eventually need to be replaced. Having said that, it does feel like we're living in an age where console graphics and power upgrades are appearing more subtle as time goes on, and while the generational cycle will doubtless continue for at least a couple of decades, it's imaginable that we reach a point that televisions have reached where huge percentages of people don't own a 4K compatible television, especially outside America, many don't have 3D functionality, and 8K hardly has any take-up at all. At certain points, consumer skepticism about the potential improvements that the new upgrade stands to provide them take over, and then you need to find a different selling point besides simply power. At this point, I think it's fair to say that games may well end up in the same boat as video. After all, the reason for video's longevity isn't an intrinsic property of the medium, but rather that, unlike video games, there is an industry standard format and most films comport to that. Now, having said that, there are plenty of films where the home video version is compromised in some way. Once Upon a Time in the West relied on an ultra-wide image, 2.35 to 1 ratio, that was built around a cinema projection, and the 1927 film Napoleon required 3 side-by-side projectors to show in the original form. Of course, you can have lots of borders and make this work on a screen for video, but it's not quite the same thing. Many films by Christopher Nolan especially use IMAX segments, which are impossible to really replicate in many cinemas, let alone at home. Then there are so-called 4D sensory experience versions of films, which largely restrict them to limited showings. In other words, there are plenty of incompatible formats of yesteryear. It's also the case that the films, like books before them, simply go out of publication, and in many respects, gaming generational shifts replicate this process. The most popular titles persist, whether in ports or deluxe editions or as backwards compatible versions of the originals, while more obscure titles disappear. Where Nintendo content finds its final form on Virtual Console or Nintendo Switch Online, videos generally end up on Prime, Netflix, Disney Plus, or innumerable other online catalogues. I don't think that these things are noticeably different between films and video games. However, I do think that Nintendo has been shifting its approach, and this is something that I've been planning to look into for some time. This is the rise and rise of what I'm going to call the forever game, games that are actually able to stay on the shelf indefinitely with only fairly minimal accommodations to the latest technology. After all, a couple of decades ago, most games were considered to be fundamentally disposable. I don't mean this in a derogatory way because most media at some point was considered this way. There are whole episodes of classic British shows like Dad's Army and Doctor Who which were literally erased because it never occurred to program makers that anybody might want to revisit them after the initial airing. Video games weren't quite in this drastic a state, but technology was fast evolving and consoles really would only last sometimes 4 or 5 years, and this had huge implications for the kind of games that could be made. Sure, Metroid and The Legend of Zelda on the original NES were great and epoch-defining titles, but then along comes Super Metroid and Zelda: A Link to the Past, which appear to be a massive evolution. I'm not saying that they actually were replacements for the prior games. In fact, the originals have underrated elements which have given the franchises new life later on when incorporated into later titles, as we saw with Breath of the Wild's emergence as a way of trying to recapture the freedom of the very first Zelda game, which was gradually chiseled away over the subsequent decades. But nobody says, oh, Godfather 3 is out, so let's forget all about Godfather 2, or boy, that new Marvel movie is out, I never need to watch one of those old ones again. New films aren't so much seen as being the best and most perfect version of their type, but rather simply another addition to a canon. But these days, while retro games definitely have their fans, the real excitement tends to accrue to newer games. In this respect, they resemble far more the way consumer products work. When a new car or vacuum cleaner that is vastly more effective or efficient hits the market, people will likely flock to the new one, and while the games were in no way one-to-one replacements, the popular perception is generally that a new version of a title will effectively absorb and build upon the gameplay experiences of previous titles. Now, even then, to some extent, films do actually take this approach. Certainly in the field of graphics and presentation, films often do try to provide a new or novel experience, such as 3D. Of course, a great many films are a pastiche of existing content, not just in terms of being parts of big franchises, but also in terms of being influenced by great films of the past. In the case of games, though, the technological improvement is generally far more obvious from year to year and generation to generation. It's certainly true that many blockbuster films benefit from ever better and frankly cheaper access to incredible image manipulation technology, benefiting even those films which don't obviously lean on special effects work, with so-called invisible visual effects work often helping to fix a multitude of sins from filming. Having said that, I'm not really sure that over the last decade or so, the improvement in visual effects has been so significant that you could really tell the difference between a 2025 and a 2015 film, and perhaps not even between that and a 2005 film, just in terms of the effects capabilities alone. In the context of games, though, the technological treadmill has become far more obvious. Reasonable people can disagree on the relative merits of, say, the Mario Kart or Animal Crossing games in the series, but if a person off the street were ranking them at least on impressions of the content, they would probably put the newest games first because aesthetically they look better and they appear to have more content. I grant you some New Leaf fans may dispute this, but as a general principle, if you want the most fully featured version of a game, the good rule of thumb is to go for the newest one on the market. However, there must be a natural limit for this. The game map of Breath of the Wild used Kyoto as a model for its size. Would the next Zelda game use the whole Kansai region, and the 2050 Zelda game use the whole of Japan as a model for the kind of scale of Hyrule that can be explored? Or would the next game simply be the same size, but with each new game progressively more realistic looking until eventually we can zoom in on Link's acne up close? Eventually, this kind of expectations inflation has to stop. It can't go on indefinitely because it only risks having diminishing returns. At this point, gaming is going to need to pivot to where films have been for some time. The fact is, films did have periods where technology changed the way films were made. Colour, most obviously, but briefly 3D saw a spate of re-releases of classic titles, and of course Disney have made big bucks from turning fan-favourite animations into soulless CGI fests in recent years. But generally speaking, other methods of differentiation were required. We have seen this happen a little at times in Nintendo's history, though. For one thing, we've seen the subdivision of franchises at times so that the original 2D Mario can be said to be the father of both the Mario Maker and the 3D Mario series, and the latter in turn has sandbox Mario and course-based Mario 3D styles, which are clear to see as distinct traditions, and you could even argue that the gravity-based spherical Mario games are distinctive from the more course-based games like Super Mario 3D Land and 3D World. Nintendo has always sought to expand and broaden out its concepts, so I would expect this to continue. It also strikes me that while Nintendo has always sought for new versions of its classic titles to be different from the previous ones and to add new elements, this is particularly true on Switch 2. Sure, Metroid Prime 4 is a sequel, but there has yet to be an original Prime game in the Switch era. But both Bonanza and Air Riders are also very new experiences for Switch within their franchises. Mario Kart World is a sequel, but it's a sequel that really does pull Mario Kart in a very different direction compared to previous titles, and it needs to do that to convince skeptical casual gamers to leave their perfectly good Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and mosey on over to a new game. All of which makes me wonder, is Nintendo looking at making Switch the first permanent generation of games? After all, while backward compatibility has long been a Nintendo staple, there has always been a natural limit. But with digital sales, it would be an increasingly difficult pitch for Nintendo not to at least emulate past consoles as it goes forward. This is a tricky one, of course, because it would add cost and complexity to new consoles. But in theory, for argument's sake, let's call it Switch 3, if that were backwards compatible with Switch 2, it would therefore be backward compatible with Switch by default, because Switch 2 is backward compatible with Switch. Physical obstacles such as the lack of a Wii U pad preventing games like Nintendo Land easily making the jump would be the only kind of limiting factor that would stop there being a consistency between generations and therefore a permanency for the game library. Now, I think this does have a big impact on the kinds of games Nintendo will look to make. Super Mario Bros. Wonder was the first 2D Mario in many years and had something to pull it apart from the new Super Mario Bros. Series. I fully believe that 2D Mario will be back, but I don't think it's by any means certain that it will be back anytime soon. And when it does return, I could see them trying to make it very clearly separate from what went before. Perhaps they expand the musical elements of Wonder to make it more rhythm-centric, or perhaps they make it more Metroidvania in scope or cross it over with other franchises. There are lots of things they could do. But what I wouldn't necessarily expect is the same kind of highly iterative titles at the same kind of pace that we saw with the new Super Mario Bros. Series releasing 4 games in the space of about 7 years. In terms of the major Zelda games, it also feels like we must at some point reach the upper limit of their capability for expansion, and so instead we're going to need to see them pivot to having significant differences between the games in order to stand out on the shelves, so that we can have multiple types of Zelda released over the period of 10 to 20 years. Now, there are exceptions to all of this. Games with strong narrative elements, games like Splatoon, which have active player bases for online where Nintendo wants to sell the games afresh. All of these I could see having lots of iterative releases. But in the main, I could see games being positioned with far greater emphasis on the ultra long term, on the evergreen market, and therefore on alleviating that sadness that Miyamoto confesses the developers feel that in the past, games have had a short shelf life. If I'm right in many ways, this is good. We'll see a lot more broad exploration of different gameplay styles and concepts, and perhaps it will mean that the developers will be able to revive some past or overlooked franchises, naming no specific Advance Wars names. But it also means that the pattern of having one big game per generation is likely to be even more embedded. It's difficult to put this into any kind of format for prediction and forecasting because this is such a subtle effect of their own psychology of game manufacturing, and so I'm not going to put a percentage to it, and perhaps I'm completely off with this, but I suspect that decades from now, some of the great games of the current era will still be being sold as new, and that Nintendo will transition to have more of a variety of different types of games within their series, rather than continuing to iterate and double down and make the most perfect version. Now, having said that, I still think there is scope for perfected versions on the Switch 2. The very nature of this console as a sequel console invites comparisons to the Super NES era, and of course, that was also a case of quite iterative games being released, and I could see the same sort of thing happening with the Switch 2 as they try to take things like Super Mario Odyssey, of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and do the absolutely perfect version. But there is going to be a natural limit Just as after the N64, the GameCube needed to pivot into different styles of gameplay, with games like Wind Waker using a completely different visual mechanic, and of course Metroid Prime completely reconceiving what it would be to be a Metroid game as it moved into 3D, I could also see Nintendo needing to pivot towards a different kind of gameplay philosophy as they pursue games post this generation. Thanks as ever for watching, and do check out this recent deep dive if you missed it. There's also a Patreon link below. I will look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.